What is good, everyone? For this video, I'm going to cover zone focusing. It's how I like to focus out there for street photography, and it's actually been one of the most common questions I've gotten on Patreon and throughout teaching and mentorships and other things like that. Partly because I do mention it a lot, I love it, but also because people just want to know a bit more about it. Sometimes it gets a little confusing, even though once you get it down, it's really easy. A while back on the blog, I made a guide to zone focusing years ago, so you can check that out. But since I've been getting it so often here on the Patreon, I wanted to make a video right now that kind of goes over the basics and gives you a good idea about zone focusing. And then at the same time, I'm working on a much more in-depth video covering it too. And so what we'll do with this video, anything that you feel like you need a little more explanation on, or maybe I need to add or certain things like that, then I can incorporate that into the more in-depth video. But for this video, I'm still going to cover all the basics and you should still get a good idea of it. So let's get into it, how to zone focus and why, and everything that goes into it. Now, personally, if I can, I almost always zone focus out there for street photography, because for me, I like to just focus on finding the interest out there and making the best photo possible, and have the camera just be a means to take that photo. But other than that, I want it kind of out of my way, just so I can focus on the interest out there in the photos. And zone focusing really helps that process, because it basically, you just have to bring the camera to your eye and you already know everything's going to be in focus where you want it once you learn how to do it. And so just bring it to your eye and take the photo. There's nothing more that gets in the way when you know how to zone focus. But what is zone focusing exactly? Well, what it means is that you have a certain distance that's in focus, a focal point there, and then a certain range behind it and a certain range in front of that point is all relatively in focus. In other words, it's a depth of field here. So if you have a subject here and you have them pre-focused right there, then you're going to have a depth of field behind them and in front of them where you have that plane, that focal range that's basically in focus. And then anything outside of that range, nearer or further out, will start to get out of focus gradually and blur. So what that means when you're out there, based on the lens you're using, the focal distance you have it preset at, and the aperture, it tells you what that focal range will be, so what that depth of field will be. So you'll already see that plane of depth out there. So then you can measure from your eyes the distance you need to be and see where everything is, and then automatically you already know that everything you want is in focus. Even though we do have cameras that are really advanced when it comes to autofocusing now, and another big thing that I prefer about zone focusing is, even if you do have a camera that's very quick about it, the autofocusing, maybe it's not even a split second to do it, you're still relying on either that camera choosing where it wants to focus, or you can spot focus. But even then, you're having to usually recompose the camera, because you're going to spot focus on what you want that distance to be, where the focal distance is, and then you move it to compose. So it still takes a little bit of time, but with zone focusing, you don't have to do that at all. You just see the photo and you bring the camera to your eye and you don't have to do anything else. So it's very quick and you don't have to even think about it. But now let's get into the heart of things, how to zone focus. There's really three things that you need to know that are going to affect that depth of field. First of all is pre-focusing that focal distance you want to have out there. So there's a couple ways you can do that. If you're out there, you can focus on a wall, but you have to figure out what you want the focal distance to be. So that's going to be more based on how you like to shoot out there. If you like to get up in there and get really close to life, you're probably going to want that focal pre-focus distance to be a little closer than if you don't get up so close and you have a little space out there when you shoot. So it really depends on you. But also, a good thing about zone focusing is you can adjust that on the fly a bit too. So maybe you have the focal distance at, usually people that do street photography have it somewhere between 1 and 1.5 meters, somewhere in there. And that's if you're getting decently close up to the life though. But maybe you see something that you do want to have a lot of space out there and involve a lot of the environment too, then you can just adjust the lens a little bit depending if you want that focal distance to go out further or come near. Maybe you have it at a certain distance, but now you want to get up really close, then you can bring it in. But really, when it gets down to it, you're just setting that pre-focus distance out there, so then you know exactly where that point is. And like I said, with depth of field, that point is the point of focus, but there's a certain range that's in focus nearer and certain range that's focused further out there, the depth of field. And that depth of field will extend out much further behind that focal distance than it will in front of it. It's one thing to remember. And when I'm talking about zone focusing and all this, I am talking about shooting manually too. So that is one thing you need to know how to do. But after pre-focusing, the next thing that matters is the aperture. The aperture affects that depth of field greatly depending on the aperture. So when it comes to aperture, if you're shooting wide open, the lower the f-stop, which is actually the larger the aperture and the wider that it opens to bring out the light, that's going to decrease that depth of field. So just imagine if you're shooting with a f1.4 lens, which is more for portraits, where you just have a very, very small point that's in focus. So think of a portrait where you focus, you can focus on the nose, or you could focus on the eyes and the nose isn't completely in focus because it's so wide open, that aperture. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, the more narrow the aperture is, the higher that f-stop. So something like f22 or f16, that's going to create a very, very long depth of field where basically most everything might be in focus. So it extends that depth of field greatly depending on how narrow you shoot. So when it comes to zone focusing, it's much easier and works a lot better when you're able to shoot at least f8. I like to shoot around f11, sometimes even f16. It gives you a lot more depth of field out there to have all the different elements that you want to be in focus. It's a lot easier to not only see and kind of guess what distance you need to shoot, but also to have that focal distance and that depth of field, include them all in there. So you have pre-focusing, you have the aperture, and the last thing is the lens you're using, more specifically the focal length of that lens. So if you have a wide angle lens, something like a 28mm, that's going to actually create much more depth of field. So like I said, when it comes to shooting narrow, like an f16, similar to that, if you're shooting a wide angle lens, it's going to create a lot larger of a depth of field. So it's not only going to make zone focusing easier, it's also going to be able to include a lot more elements into that depth of field. But then on the opposite spectrum, again, say you have a long focal length, something like a 90mm, then you're going to get that depth of field is going to squeeze quite a bit, and it just doesn't work as well for zone focusing. But usually if you're doing street photography, you're up more close to the life, you're shooting a more wide angle lens. And one thing I have to mention is when I'm talking about focal length of the lens, I'm talking about the true focal length of the lens. So if you use a mirrorless camera like me, I'm using this X Pro here, Fujifilm, I'm using a crop sensor. So while the true focal length of the lens is 18mm, the actual equivalent in a crop sensor is around 27-28mm. So I'm able to shoot the actual length of around 27mm, but when it comes to zone focusing, I'm getting to use an 18mm, the true focal length of the lens, which actually creates an advantage of zone focusing because now I'm using a lens that's much wider, which makes that depth of field wider compared to if I was using a full frame camera with the equivalent of 28mm. I would get the same focal length, but I wouldn't get the same benefit of having the true focal length of an 18mm, if that makes sense. So that is one advantage of a mirrorless camera like this. It makes zone focusing easier at the same focal lengths because you're actually using a wider true focal length. So coming from a full frame, I used to shoot full frame and I used to zone focus on a Leica M9, and you had to be, and I was actually shooting a 35mm full frame on that. So you had to be, your guesswork of that focal depth of field, not only was it smaller, you had to be better at seeing what was going to be in focus before you took the photo. So it is much easier. An 18mm on the Fujifilm X Pro makes zone focusing quite a bit easier. But those are the three things that are going to affect it, and those are the three things that you need to know about when you're out there zone focusing. But it also brings one other big point, and one negative or one challenge maybe of zone focusing is you do need some decent light out there to make it easier on you and also be able to have that longer depth of field. And that's because out of those three things, one of them included aperture, and aperture affects how much light is brought in. And unfortunately, when it comes to zone focusing, it affects it somewhat in odds with zone focusing. And what I mean by that is, like I said, if you're shooting narrow like an f16, you're getting that long depth of field out there, but that doesn't bring as much light as if you're shooting it wide open. So if you have a bright sunny day out there, you can shoot it at f11, f16 without a problem. But if it's more of an overcast day or a darker day out there, you're probably going to have to open up the aperture a bit to bring in the light to get the correct exposure, but that's also going to decrease that depth of field a bit too. So it's a little bit at odds with that, and it's one thing to know out there. So that's why when it gets darker and darker, and maybe you're having to go down to f5.6 or maybe even f4.0, once you get around that range, it gets that depth of field squeezes quite a bit, and you're not able to include as much in focus, and you're also how you see it and guess the focal plane there, because now it's smaller, it's a little harder to see. But with the experience, you do get better at kind of seeing the distances out there, even when you have to open up the aperture a bit, or you're using not quite as wide of an angle of a lens. Things like that. So there's ways to see it. You're going to get used to it. You're going to start noticing, like, I think that object over there is around 1.5 meters, and you'll get better at guessing that. But another thing you can do to really know that depth of field is look at a depth of field calculator, and I'll include one below. I'll link to one. So that gives you kind of an idea of how the different, the 3 different categories I talked about there that affect that depth of field. It shows you how greatly that it does affect them. Now, a lot of your cameras now, like the Fujifilm X Pro 3, all of them really, but they do give you that focal distance there that gives you that depth of field calculator. Now, they're usually not very accurate, and they usually are on they kind of edge on the end of making that depth of field much smaller than it is. So it might tell you that everything, from 1 meter to 6 meters is in focus, but in reality, that depth of field is much greater. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And there is actually a focal distance in combination with the aperture and the focal length of the lens. We're at that pre-focus distance. Everything beyond basically to infinity is in focus. It's called the hyperfocal distance. So when you have that bright light out there and you're shooting with a wide angle and you're also shooting at a narrow f-stop, then you can get a pre-focus distance that's not too far ahead, where everything is basically in focus. And that actually brings something I should have mentioned when I was talking about the pre-focus distance, is the further out that pre-focus distance is, again, the wider that depth of field gets. So if your pre-focus distance is only 1 meter or even nearer, then that depth of field is going to squeeze in quite a bit. Sometimes you need to bring it in when you have a subject you want somewhat in focus. You're going to have to bring in that focal distance, but then that depth of field is going to shorten up quite a bit. So that's why sometimes a sweet spot, if you're able to shoot at a wide angle lens with some light and have a narrow aperture, then you can get the prefocal distance somewhere between 1 meter and 1.5 meters, and then you're going to have most things in focus. So to recap real quick, when it comes to what increases that depth of field, one is how far out that focal distance, that pre-focus distance is, how narrow that aperture is, and how wide of an angle that lens is. All those things, the wider, the more narrow, and the further out that focal distance is, will make that depth of field larger too. So that brings me, actually, that video probably went longer than I really wanted it to be. This was supposed to be more of a condensed version, but hopefully there's a lot of information to share on it. It is a lot simpler once you really learn those basics though, and once you get out there and get used to it, it comes pretty easy. When it comes to me, just so you know, my normal settings out there, or what I like to zone focus with, if I have a good amount of light, that's what I want. I have usually an f-stop around f11, sometimes f16, and that really makes that focal depth of field good. And then I'm shooting obviously on the 18 millimeter, 27 millimeter equivalent, but sometimes I'm using a 35 right here, or the 23 millimeter true focal length. And then I have the pre-focus distance around 1.3 meters usually. And then from there, again, like I mentioned, you can kind of do it on the fly. What I like to do, this is one last tip I should mention, is when you have your pre-focus distance locked in, which you can do with this camera, you can do with a lot of cameras, but if not, you can just have it set so that pre-focus distance that you like I said, mine is usually around 1.3 meters. I'm going to have that 1.3 meters with this pointed right down here. So I added this tab right here, but if you have like a Leica, it's already built into the lens. Then when I have this tab pointing down, when I have it at my pre-focus distance, then I know where it's at when it's down, so I can always reset it by putting it down. But then also on the fly, if I need to bring in the focal distance, I can move it accordingly, or if I need to extend the pre-focus distance, I can extend it accordingly. And then when I want to bring it back to the normal, I just point it down again. So that's just kind of a small tip to do. That's why I put that tab on there, because I definitely missed that. So if your camera doesn't have one, I would recommend getting one. It was only around $10, and the actual name of it is Tab, T-A-A-B. So just Google that, you should be able to find it. But that brings me to the end of this video on zone focusing, what it is, why I do it, and how to do it, and all the basics in between. And if there's anything you feel like would be important for me to include in the more in-depth video I'm creating, or anything you'd like more explanation or me to add, just let me know. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video. Cheers.